guest speaker program. I'd like to ask Shinjin Mike Goldman to introduce our guest this morning. And we're looking forward to a lively discussion, an interesting subject.
Our guest speaker this morning, we're lucky to have Dr. Bruce Boehrer from Florida State University. He's a literature professor and is also a practitioner of one of the Korean schools of Zen. So there's a lot of sitting experience in Buddhism, as well as very advanced knowledge of English and American literature. And today's subject is going to be Shakespeare and Buddhism.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you for the opportunity to sit with you this morning. I enjoyed that. It's been a while. And so, yeah, you know, I've spent a lot of my life talking to people about Shakespeare, and I've spent a much smaller amount of my life, but still a bit, talking, you know, about Buddhism and Dharma talks. Never been asked to do the two simultaneously, though, before, and so this seemed intriguing to me. Also, perhaps a good way to make a monkey out of me. But in any case, that being where we're going, I should start, I suppose, with one thing I've learned from 30-odd years of teaching, which is that everything needs to be said. And so I will begin with a couple of completely unsurprising disclaimers, but I will make them nonetheless. First of all, I'm going to talk a little about Buddhism, but I have obviously no attainment, no authority, no accomplishment in the, thank you, in the interview room. I don't know, somewhere between toaster ovens and larger kitchen appliances. But I have sat for a few years and I've done a very little bit of reading in the Tripitaka. And so what I'm going to talk about reflects that. And being, you know, a Shakespeare teacher by profession, I have had to think over time, no thanks, about the connections between Buddhist practice and Shakespeare. So that's where I'm headed. Disclaimer number 2, the first thing that any serious historian needs to say in addressing a subject like Shakespeare and Buddhism is that there is no connection between the two halves of the title. There is no formal connection whatsoever, in fact, between Buddhism and Shakespeare. Something that is easily demonstrated. This will, as I say, I think surprise you not at all, but I will take some length to demonstrate it anyway. All you need to do is go to a Shakespeare concordance and look up the word Buddhism, and you will find that there are no references, no occurrences of that word in Shakespeare's works. You look up the word Buddha, and you will find the same result. Same for Dharma, same for Sangha. If you want to search further, you will find that Shakespeare never mentions the Four Noble Truths, never mentions the Noble Eightfold Path. And if you search carefully, you will find not a single reference to any piece of the Tripitaka anywhere in his 37 plays, 154 sonnets, and 2 Apilya. So there is no textual record whatsoever. There is no evidence either in Shakespeare's life that he was at all aware of Buddhism. And in this respect, he is hardly unusual in his day. The norm would be a lack of awareness of Buddhism, although there would have been scholars in Shakespeare's day who would have known something about it. There is Western awareness of the Buddhist practice going back to ancient times, but really only in very, very limited communities of study.
Excuse me, did you say in Shakespeare's time there would have been some awareness? Some awareness,
yeah. A couple of the early church fathers, Clement of Alexandria, I believe, and I think St. Jerome also are aware of Buddhism. They're particularly aware of the tradition of Buddha's virgin birth, and compare that to the comparable doctrine in Christianity. But during Shakespeare's day, there's beginning to be a kind of a historical engagement between Western exploration and the Buddhist nations, particularly through the Portuguese, but also through the Dutch later on. We could maybe go into that later. But for the most part, Buddhism, not something that Shakespeare's England is aware of. And in that respect, Shakespeare is absolutely characteristic. And by contrast, in fact, the space you would expect Buddhism to occupy in Shakespeare's life, if it occupied a space, is very clearly filled up by something else entirely. And here, of course, we're talking about unmistakable connections to Christianity in at least one of its major early confessional forms. And it's a good conversation we might have about how many of those confessional forms he's really engaged with. But what we know is, the first thing we know about him is that he's baptized into the communion of the Church of England at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon on April 26th, 1564. We know that 18 years later, he's married in the same parish church, according to the Anglican rite. His wife is, at that point, 26. He's 18. She's also 3 months pregnant. His children are baptized in the same congregation of the Church of England. And in 1616, Shakespeare is laid to rest there as well in Holy Trinity Church. And if you've been to Stratford-upon-Avon, you will probably have seen the tombstone, and you will remember perhaps the inscription on it. Shakespeare's epitaph, presumably self-written: "Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man who spares these stones, and cursed be he who moves my bones." You know, the operative word here, the key word for us, of course, is Jesus. Although one could spend some time talking about the whole business of bone moving as well, something that apparently exercised Shakespeare's imagination. You will remember, for instance, that it is the stage business of Act 5, Scene 1 of Hamlet, the so-called gravedigger scene, where the gravediggers in question are found exhuming bones from the cemetery. This is a common practice in Shakespeare's day. Most bodies are not buried in coffins. They are wrapped in cerements, winding sheets, and simply put in the ground to decompose. And then, waste not, want not, the sextons will come along and dig up the bones, and put them into a charnel house and recycle the graves. Something that apparently Shakespeare is concerned about. And you could again connect this to his Christian belief in the resurrection of the body, something that gets a bit scrambled once you exhume the remains and place them in a charnel house. So there is all that. As I say, I could add that there's a robust conversation about Shakespeare's confessional affiliations, whether he was actually C of E, Church of England, or a covert Catholic of some kind. There seems to be evidence of Catholicism and illegal Catholicism in Elizabethan England in Shakespeare's family, but another matter. All of this being said, though, that we can go on maybe to talk about Shakespeare's verse in terms of its correspondence to various notions central to Buddhist practice. This makes sense to me. Buddhism is Buddhism because it offers, among other things, a powerful account of reality. Shakespeare is Shakespeare, among other reasons, because he too offers a powerful account of reality that people have often recognized and as in some sense deeply true. It makes sense, therefore, that the two should converge, that they should overlap, that they should harmonize in various ways. And so what I just wanted to do today was to go through the handouts I've given you and talk a little bit about how the passages I've included there correspond to certain kinds of concepts in Buddhist practice. And concept one is the concept of samsara. If we're talking about Buddhism and Shakespeare as offering accounts of reality, this is perhaps where we need to start. Samsara, the Sanskrit word, means wandering or perhaps world. But generally, as I understand it, at least, referring to the endless, pointless, unsatisfying nature of existence without enlightenment. It is cyclical. It goes on, up and down. The changes occur, but they are ultimately insignificant. And in fact, as I understand it, the key features of samsara are its endlessness, its aimlessness, and its emptiness. Events coming and going, but lacking full meaning, lacking full being, appearing perhaps as images or appear to us in a mirror. There, but not there at the same time. To this end, or in support of this, I would cite the Samyutta Nikaya. Inconceivable is any beginning of this samsara, An earliest point is not discerned of beings who, obstructed by spiritual ignorance and fettered by craving, run and wander on. An endless kind of ebb and flow, ultimately of no significance, ultimately accomplishing nothing. Here's the cycle of suffering depicted by the first noble truth, and Buddhism develops an immense spatial and chronological framework, this vast Buddhist cosmology, to account for it. But the main truth here, for my purposes at least, lies in the endless futility of worldly struggle, which only offers empty promises of meaning and fulfillment. So then the book of causation. What is more, what is greater, the stream of tears which you have shed as you have roamed and wandered on through this long course, weeping and wailing because of being united with the disagreeable and separated from the agreeable? Is this greater, or is the water in the four great oceans? A sea of suffering, ebbing and flowing, never ending, going nowhere. As a Shakespearean, I think about this, and I think of a number of passages in Shakespeare that seem to offer a similar view of our lot. And the most important one, or the most obvious, perhaps the most resonant one, comes for me from Macbeth. The very famous Act 5 speech after Macbeth has been told that his wife has died. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow crawls on this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, but a poor player that frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Wonderful Faulknerian resonance there, for us in the South. And you might look at it and say, as I've said, Macbeth at least, imagines an end, the last syllable. But know that it's the last syllable of recorded time. Memory may end, but the progression and the pointless progression of things here goes on, arguably. All of it empty of significance. Like the babbling of an idiot, full, yet simultaneously, you'll notice this fullness and emptiness, full of sound and fury, but empty of meaning, empty of significance, empty of resolution. And then there's King Lear, Act 5, Scene 2. Here, Edgar, Gloucester's good son, encountering the blinded Gloucester in despair at the end of the play, thinking of casting himself off a cliff, and telling him, buck up. You might want to do that, but you don't get out that easily. Men must endure their going hence, even as their coming hither. Ripeness is all. The implicit metaphor, you could take it out of the book of Ecclesiastes. All flesh is grass. Ties into the cyclical nature of natural processes, which are also the cyclical nature of samsara. And in both the case of Macbeth and in the case of King Lear, what you've got here, I think, distinctively for Shakespeare is a non-Christian, a pre-Christian sensibility being put on display. You could compare King Lear's or Edgar's line, ripeness is all, to Hamlet, coming to much the same point of his play and foreseeing his end, who says, the readiness is all. For Hamlet, living in a Christian universe, there is something to get ready for Gloucester, for Edgar in this pre-Christian world of King Lear. There is nothing but ripening and rotting and the endless cycle of suffering. You get it too. Let me see. I don't think I have. Yeah. All right. You get it too in the lengthiest passage I've got for you here from As You Like It, the 7 Ages of Man speech. Here in a comic formulation, but the figure who delivers this speech is distinguished in the play as being melancholic. And here he gives vent to his melancholy and elevates it to a principle of the rhythms of nature. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. The one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. At first, the infant mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, and then the whining schoolboy with his satchel and shining morning face creeping like snail unwillingly to school. And then the lover, sighing like furnace, and a woeful ballad, with a woeful ballad made to his mistress' eyebrow, then a soldier full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard, jealous in honor, sudden and quick in quarrels, seeking the bubble reputation even in the cannon's mouth. And then the justice in fair round belly with good capon lined, with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise saws and modern instances, and so he plays his part. The 6th age shifts into the lean and slippered pantaloon, with spectacles on nose and pouch on side. His youthful hose well saved a world too wide for his shrunk shank, and his big manly voice, turning again toward childish treble, pipes and whistles in his sound. Last scene of all, that ends this strange eventful history, is second childishness and mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. Again, the emphasis upon cycles. Again, cycles that are full of activity, full of characteristics, full of distinction, and yet a distinction that in the end means nothing. It collapses into what? Second childishness and mere oblivion. And it's hard for me to read this passage without hearing in the end of it a kind of an echo of the Heart Sutra. No eyes, no ears, no tongue, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. What you get in this also, as in the Macbeth before that we've looked at, you get in one other passage that I offer as a kind of parallel to the notion of samsara, and that's actually from the sonnets, sonnet 15. I think it's sonnet 15. I don't have I actually gave you all my handouts and don't have one myself, but I do have the words here. When I consider everything that grows, holds in perfection but a little moment, that this huge stage presenteth not, but shows, whereon the stars in secret influence comment. When I perceive that men as plants increase, cheered and checked even by the self-same sky, vaunt in their youthful sap, at height decrease, and wear their brave state out of memory, then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you most rich in youth before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay to change your day of youth to sullied night, and all in war with time for love of you, as he takes from you, I engraft you new. It's one of the group of sonnets that Shakespeareans call the young man sonnets. The sonnets apparently addressed to a young gentleman, often identified with Henry Wriothesley, 2nd Earl of Southampton. And here you've got a really wonderfully Shakespearean moment in a couple of different ways. On one hand, it's a patronage poem. Shakespeare addresses the problem we all face of mortality, a problem built into samsara, the cyclical nature of it, and describes it with a series of metaphors I won't go into, but a couple that deserve quick notice. This huge stage, line 3, presenteth not but shows, whereon the stars in secret influence comment. Here, Shakespeare likens the world to a stage. Surprise. The third of these 4 passages I've given you to do so, in this characteristically Shakespearean metadramatic moment as he explores the interrelation between art and life, mimesis and reality. And also, you'll notice kind of built into that a reference to astrology. Astrology, perhaps interesting in terms of its relation to South Asian and Southeast Asian culture as well. But in each of these cases, for Shakespeare, life is a part to play, or a series of parts to play. It's an illusion precisely because it is a bit of theater. Shakespeare, as theater professional himself, understanding the nature of what he does to be illusion. Well, it's an interesting notion, and an easy one again, perhaps, to compare to some of the ideas of samsara that we are accustomed to. The idea of coming and going as a shadow, the idea of coming and going as an image in a mirror. Here, comparable to the coming and going of the actor who is simultaneously there and not there. He is who he pretends to be and is not who he pretends to be at the same time. Again, this kind of duality, the self-canceling character of the activity. It's not something you find in Buddhist scripture for the most part, and there is, I think, a good reason for that. The societies of Southeast and East Asia, I think you could bracket off the Japanese as an exception to the rule, but particularly in India and in Southeast Asia, where Buddhism originates, not having comparable theatrical traditions to that within which Shakespeare operates. What they do have that kind of parallels that is a tradition of puppet theater, particularly the shadow puppets, of course, of Indonesia and Burma and Siam and so forth. And so you find in the Dharmapada a passage like this: "Look at your body, a painted puppet, a poor toy of jointed parts ready to collapse, a diseased and suffering thing with a head full of false imaginings, the puppet there, simultaneously present and not present, figuring life but not fully encompassing it, awash like us in the sea of samsara." Well, sorry?
Interesting in that regard.
Oh.
Take apart the chariot. Where's the chariot?
Yeah. Oh. So there's that. I think Shakespeare provides a series of interesting kinds of parallel formulations to the concept of samsara, and those are some examples. A second concept I would move on to is that of karma, something that corresponds very nicely in a variety of ways. Shakespeare is a poet, and as a poet, he is given to the performance of poetic justice. He is inherently interested in the way in which the moral consequences of actions balance each other out and ensue naturally from one another. The notion of karma, as I understand it in Buddhism, a particularly complicated one. I've puzzled over it for a long time and don't know entirely, of course, what to make of it. But the word from the Sanskrit means action or work or deed or something like that. And in the kind of most generally accepted formulation, it refers to a natural process of causation whereby bad actions receive their own and generate their own punishment. And you get that again in King Lear real nicely. As Edgar again declares of his father, referring to him in the third person this time, the gods are just, and of our pleasant vices make instruments to plague us. The dark and vicious place where thee he got cost him his eyes. Here's Edgar talking to Edmund, his half-brother and bastard brother, as the latter lies dying after their final combat at the end of the play. Telling him, you've gotten what you've deserved. The wheel has come full circle. Likewise, for our father, the gods are just. This justice embodied in the cycle of, well, Shakespeare would call it sin. We would call it unenlightened behavior and retribution. The vice that produces Edmund, eventually costing the father his eyes. Another nice example, I've been looking at a play not often read and even less often acted of late, Timon of Athens, It's a play about a noble Athenian, a wealthy Athenian who turns over his goods in generosity to his friends, and then in duress and need himself is rejected by them out of resentment to human ingratitude. He then abandons society and takes up life in a forest near Athens, where he is approached by a philosopher who tells him essentially, why should you be angry with the people who have abused you, taken your money, and then refused to help you when you needed help? You deserve what you get from them by opening your doors to them, by opening your coffers to them. You have simply encouraged their bad behavior. Now it has come around to bite you on the bottom, so to speak. Thou wast told thus. You were told what kind of people these were. Thou gavest thine ears like tapsters that bade welcome to knaves and all approachers. Your ears bid welcome to them like tapsters. Timon throws open his home, entertains, feeds, and runs himself bankrupt in the process. 'Tis most just thus that thou turn rascal. Hadst thou wealth again, rascals should have it. You have fed rascals, therefore it only makes sense that you should become one. Again, this kind of natural balance, this symmetry, this parallelism between transgression on the one hand and recompense on the other, which is self-generated. It's really kind of the other side of the act of transgression itself. The school of Zen I practice in goes a little further. Our master, Sungsan Sinsanim, went a little further in terms of dealing with karma. His definition of the term was just mental habits. The idea being that the thought precedes the action, and therefore really properly considered is its origin and also its end. And on this view, I think karma begins with interpretation, what we make of the world around us. It begins with the interior experience, and kind of corresponds to one of the great opening lines in Western philosophy from Arthur Schopenhauer's World is Will and Representation. He's heavily influenced by Buddhism and Hinduism. His opening line is, the world is my representation. We make the world in ourselves. We make the world in a process of perception, and the way we make it then fashions its response to us, as it were. It's programmed into it by our own understanding. And I think we get a kind of a nice Shakespearean version of this sentiment in Hamlet, Act 2. Remember when his good buddies Rosencrantz and Guildenstern come to see him to find out what's wrong with him, and he turns to them and asks them, "What have you, my good friends, deserved at the hands of fortune that she sends you to prison hither?" Guildenstern is flabbergasted. "This is not prison, you're in a palace." "Prison, my lord? Denmark's a prison. Then is the world one, a goodly one, in which there are many confines, wards, and dungeons, Denmark being one of the worst." Rosencrantz begs to differ. "We think not so, my lord." And then Hamlet comes around, of course, to the punchline. "Why then 'tis none to you, for there is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. To me it is a prison. Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space." Here, the act of interpretation, which forms the world, preceding the physical acts that occur within it, and constituting, in this case, the prison of the prison of the mind, self-generated prison of the mind. So, how am I doing for time? Am I overrunning my allotment?
It's 11:30 right now.
Okay. Well, I had then the last little bit of my handout, the second page. And you know what? I do not have a copy of that. Could you guys give me one, please? Thanks very much, Mike. Yeah. This is a wonderful poem, a poem I've steadfastly refused to teach. I've never talked about it to anybody before because I like it so much. Some things, just better not talked about. But I'm going to break that rule now today because It has for a long time struck me as really one of the classic Renaissance formulations of the concept of emptiness. And here, therefore, comparable to, sunyata in Buddhist practice, the emptiness that is simultaneously full. I've been talking about it in terms of samsara. And here we've got a lengthy poem by John Donne, Nocturnal upon St. Lucy's Day, an amazing bit of work and typically complicated recherche kind of metaphysical performance. Not going to spend time going through it line by line. Just say this about it. St. Lucy's Day in the liturgical calendar is the winter solstice. So this is a poem about the shortest day of the year, which in the London area is pretty short. As he says in the second line, it's scarce, the sun's scarce 7 hours itself unmasks. And that's about right. It's also, being St. Lucy's Day, a convenient day for Donne to use as premise of his poem, because he is here writing about the demise of his patroness, Lucy, Countess of Bedford. And you will also perhaps notice that the word Lucy itself contains within it an appropriate interlingual pun, since it derives from the Latin lux, lucus, or light. So this is a poem about loss of life, about the sinking of the world's sap, about darkness, but also darkness that is somehow populated by, interrelated with shades with strains of light. And in this poem, the principal kind of argument that runs is that Donne has, by his patroness's death, been himself diminished and reduced to nothing. We then, in typical virtuoso Donnean fashion, ask the question, what kind of nothing are we talking about? What do you mean by nothing? And Donne runs through a whole series of elaborate comparisons and modes of analysis to suggest what kind. 'Tis the year's midnight starts. Here it is. The midnight of the year, the winter solstice. And it is the days, Lucy's, who scarce 7 hours herself unmasks. The sun is spent, the sun gone, little flickering on the horizon, sending forth light squibs, little firecracker shots of light, no constant rays. The world's whole sap then sunk. The idea here of the life force sinking in a body as it lies in bed, sinking toward the feet of the bed as the body loses life, ending up the first stanza. Stanza 2, Donne declares, I am every dead thing. I am nothing. I am every dead thing in whom love wrought new alchemy, for his art did express a quintessence even from nothingness. From dull privations and lean emptiness, he ruined me, and I am rebegot of absence, darkness, death, things which are not. Donne imagines himself as vicariously participating in his patroness's demise, and thus also reduced to nothing. The particular passage I want to draw your attention to, though, comes in the next to last stanza, where Donne then runs through the question of how to understand nothing, how to categorize it, how to make sense of different kinds of nothings. I am by her death, which word wrong, sir, of the first nothing, the elixir grown. I am reduced to a nothing greater than all other nothings, or lower than all other nothings, prior to all other nothings, the first nothing. We then get a reference to Aristotelian thinking about species difference. Men are different from animals, women are different presumably as well, because we want to know. If were I a man, that I were one, I must know. I should prefer, if I were any beast, some ends, some means. Here, the Aristotelian animal soul, which drives animals to search for mates, search for food, but not to engage in higher reasoning. Yea, plants, yea, stones detest. If you look at a plant, you will see that it grows toward the sun rather than into the shade. That expresses a preference, even though the plant has no apparent control of its actions, no way of recognizing ends and means. Stones, too, to test and love. Think about magnets, which draw to one another or repel. So that all of these forms of being, sentient and non-sentient, possess some sort of attractive power, some sort of soul, as it were. And indeed, we could go farther than that. If I, an ordinary nothing, were as shadow, a light and body must be here. Think of shadow. And here we are in Buddhist territory very clearly, you know, the thing that is there but not there at the same time. And says, I'm even more empty than that, because in order to generate the shadow, you must have nonetheless an implied substance, a backing substance, a substance that the shadow depends upon and the light behind it to cast it. No, my nothing is deeper than that. My nothing is more nothing than that, Dunn says. And yet you look at the poem and you see how in the process of formulating this notion of his reduction to nothing, he has gone through a remarkably rich series of symbols, series of images, series of metaphors, figures of speech, conjuring up beasts and magnets and plants and the hydroptic earth and the Aristotelian species difference philosophy and any number of other things as well. This is a poem that casts itself as a poem about nothing, but nothing that is filled with action, filled with things, filled with substance. And thus the kind of dualism that you also see in the Buddhist notion of sunyata. An emptiness, but an emptiness that encompasses everything that we are. And I guess we'll leave it at that. Thanks. Thanks.
Anybody has anything they'd like to bring up or ask? I have a few comments, but I'll wait till later.
First of all, I think that was a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. One of the things that always kind of strikes me about the Shakespeare tragedies is the main character always seems to be totally tied up in some emotional state, some variant of greed, hate, and delusion, which winds up usually costing them everything. Yeah. And I just wondered if there was like any of the tragic characters that you thought of when you read these works is like, man, that guy sure could be used to sit in practice. You know, if this guy sat still enough long enough, he wouldn't be in this state.
Lear could certainly have used a few hours on the cushion.
Yeah.
He's the classic one. I mean, if we think of the three poisons, anger, ignorance, and greed, what have we got in Lear? We've got anger obviously manifesting itself in his disowning Cordelia. We have ignorance, equally obvious, in his misjudgment of character, thinking that Regan and Cordelia are the true daughters, and valuing them over Cordelia. Greed too, although you would think perhaps that would be the least manifest of the three in Lear's case, but Lear is also greedy. How can a king be greedy? What is a king greedy for? In his case, tell me that you love me, and tell me loud where people can hear, so that you can see all three of the poisons kind of generating that moment in Act 1 when Lear casts off Cordelia, turns to God all Regan and places himself at their tender mercies. Yeah, I mean, Macbeth too, easy enough to understand in that light. But Macbeth, interesting particularly because perhaps from the standpoint of karma, maybe I should put in another passage from that way, because he understands as he takes the knife to Duncan that there will be ill consequences. Uh, and oh gosh, the soliloquy at the end of Act 1. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to remember it. In which he imagines the fame of this deed like a newborn babe blasted against the times to come, blown in a gale to convey the dishonor and shame of what he is about to. He sees that there is on one level, very clear likelihood of consequences, unhappy ones for the act he undertakes. And yet he also tries to imagine a situation in which he could disconnect himself from those consequences. It's easy to read Macbeth kind of as an ecological play too, because he tries through his connections with weird sisters to withdraw himself from the fabric of society around him, from the seasonal passages of time and nature. It's appropriate that a play like that should end with the forest marching upon the villain. I don't know what other ones, Antony and Cleopatra. That's.
They seem to be caught up in the web of circumstance, causes, and conditions, which is a very Buddhist principle.
Yeah,
And their way out.
another one that always, I never could really figure out which of the poisons had overtaken Hamlet.
Well, that is the question. I mean, Hamlet is, Hamlet's the perennially put forward as the most cerebral one.
Yeah.
The one that's not marked by obvious. At least his character is not marked by obvious excesses of anger, obvious excesses of greed. On the contrary, one of his functions is kind of the satirical taking the piss of greedy sycophants like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. Hamlet's problem is a problem of knowledge, and in that sense, can cast him as a quasi or Buddhist figure. I think. How do I know what I know? Where does it come from? How can I test it? How does my version of reality relate to the thing in itself?
I think that's like fabulous though, because it's like direct experience. Constantly like going in to establish the relationship for themselves. So it's like my perception. What do I know? It's constantly questioning. I like that.
It is a constant questioning, and a questioning just of not just of what's happening, but of how he can know it happens as well. The devil hath power to his pleasing shape, he says of his father's ghost. How do I know that this is not that? How do I know that there is no life after death? But dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. So it becomes a kind of a tragedy of philosophical uncertainty, and that philosophical uncertainty is also the thing that Schopenhauer gets from Buddhism and from Hinduism. This notion that we make the world, and we have to live with the consequences of the world we make.
Yeah, and the Buddha was really clear that the world is constantly in flux.
Mm-hmm. It is, and so you get, and Shakespeare is a poet of a pre-industrial society, which is still, closely connected to cyclical events in nature. They're reflected in the liturgy, both the Catholic and the Anglican liturgy, which correspond to the cycles of the year. Shakespeare grew up, of course, in the Midlands, in a small, by our standards, quite small farming village with lots of land around him. When he was a successful man in London, he started plowing his earnings back into real estate acquisitions in the area. He purchased farmland and a good bit of it. The idea of seasonal patterns natural to him in any number of ways. What you get, of course, with Christianity is this kind of movement beyond the seasonal patterns, and that differentiates, Shakespeare differentiates Hamlet's readiness is all from Lear's ripeness is all. There is this idea of transcendence in the Christian that Shakespeare does not attribute to his pre-Christian or non-Christian characters.
There's an interesting connection of rightness to Zen as well. Huineng had no teacher and no practice, but he was enlightened, so he was right. He was ripe and ready. It also ties back to what you said about Shakespeare in the farm, having country, growing crops and things on the countryside. I had a historicity question for you, and I want to see if somebody else has a question. But one of the things that's, I think, startling about Shakespeare is he seems to be able to get in the minds of all of the different characters and sort of see, like Rashomon, the film, see it from their perspective, and it's a totally different reality. Is there any evidence in the history that it was a group project, that he had like a staff of writers, or was it like like a comedy show today?
Yeah, I mean that question inevitably it becomes the anti-Stratfordian question. Did Shakespeare really write these plays, or were they written instead by Sir Francis Bacon, or
Edward
Staff.
Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford?
Collaborative project or something.
Yeah, and that's really unfortunate, because once you get pulled into that conversation, you're ignoring the really interesting stuff, which is that there is no question that Shakespeare collaborated. And there is every reason to suppose that his collaborations run deeper than we're aware. For instance, in Macbeth, there are very clear passages in that play that had been lifted out of an earlier play by Thomas Middleton. And the question then becomes, well, did aliens do that? Or perhaps was it because Middleton and Shakespeare were in the process of collaboration when they composed Macbeth? Other plays clearly involving some measure of collaboration. Henry VIII, back when Shakespeare's essentially retired, he's been replaced by a playwright named John Fletcher, who's the key writer for the King's Men, but apparently runs into trouble with the script for Henry VIII. And so Shakespeare comes
I heard all of that sort of in the context of plagiarism and who's getting credit for what. But I often wondered, because Shakespeare had this, he wrote all this himself, it seemed like he had this unique ability to be all the different characters, so much. So somebody else have something?
Thank you.
First of all, although Shakespeare is English, I always kind of viewed it as a foreign language, and I just want to compliment you on how you explained in this lecture. But one of the things that I was curious about is prior to my study here in Buddhism, I did a lot of research in personality typing, the precursor to modern day psychology, some of the oldest being astrology and the Enneagram. I don't know if
phrenology and
that each personality type has different personality types, and they each have a struggle with virtue versus seduction, and the light versus the dark, and so on and so forth. And I just it's interesting to me that Shakespeare had the ability, like Sensei was sharing, to not only take a personality type, but maintain its accuracy within that particular type of personality, that this type of personality would do this, make this choice, or this personality would have this disintegration points, and so on and so forth. So is there any, I guess my question is there any validity to Shakespeare having studied some of these personality typing?
Yeah, he couldn't not have, actually. There are systems of phrenology, books on the subject available in the 16th century. There are various other modes of classifying personality that Shakespeare would have had to know, most particularly those associated with Galenic physiology, the physiology of the ancient Roman-era Greek physician Galen, who posited the notion of humoral interaction in the body composed of 4 humors. What are they? Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, choler. These corresponding to the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and all of them present in bodies in differing proportions, which in turn help constitute character traits. So that if you know The Taming of the Shrew, that play begins with a character, Tinker, being brought to bed. He's gotten drunk and been thrown out of a pub, and so a lord finds him, brings him home, dresses him up, and to play a joke on him, tries to convince him that he is himself a lord, this Tinker, Christopher Sly, who has just woken up after years of madness. And so he says, since you're awake, you're on the mend, the doctors have suggested that you should watch a pleasant comedy. And that becomes the play within the play that is the bulk of the Taming of the Shrew. And the whole purpose of that play being performed for Christopher Sly is that comedy is supposed to be good for the humors. It's supposed to buck you up. Laughter, as we say, is the best medicine. Take 2 sitcoms and see me in the morning. That's the theory. Shakespeare very, very aware of that. He plays with particularly humoral psychology in a variety of ways. I mean, this is you mentioned the word plagiarism. Sorry, it takes me off on another tangent. The word plagiarism is coined at roughly this time, in the early 1600s, and coined by Shakespeare's friend and younger contemporary Ben Jonson, who, unlike Shakespeare, is very interested in laying claim to the work he writes, and resentful of people who snap it up. That pulled me away from humoral psychology, though. But humoralism is the main way in which psychology and psychology types are understood.
There's probably some parallel with Chinese medicine and that too that you'll find in early Buddhism. Anybody else have something that you would like to bring up, Tom?
I have a question. I see in Hamlet something akin to the sort of Mahayana idea of the Bodhisattva ideal. So in Mahayana Buddhism, Buddhahood is sort of a settled issue. There's the Buddhas of the past and the Buddhas of the future and the Buddhas of the spiritual realm. But in this world, there are people who are given the opportunity to become Buddhas and they choose not to, and they stay so that they can help. And when I see Hamlet, he says, that this too solid flesh would melt thaw and resolve itself as a dew. He wishes that he could cling to everything in the world, but he can't, because Hamlet has bad dreams, because Hamlet dislikes the world. So he conceives of this ideal, but he stays to fight Hamlet's battle. And I was wondering if there is a higher ideal than Hamlet in Shakespeare.
Well, I mean, it's interesting in Hamlet because actually that pattern continues to the end of the play as Hamlet himself lies dead, or dying rather, and his friend Horatio cradles him and says, "I am more a noble Roman than a Dane. I'm getting ready to follow you, and I'll commit suicide as soon as you're done." Hamlet says, "Forgive me, I can't remember the lines exactly. Pause in this world and draw pain in this world and proclaim my cause, defend my wounded name. You need to remain behind. You have work to do, even though you would rather follow."
There's an interesting, one of the warning states in Shringama Sutra is, there are 50 warning states, one of each of the 5 skandhas, that you may reach a certain point in your meditation where this happens. Don't get confused and think you're now enlightened. Right? Just keep going on. And one of them was, now at this point you can die. You can literally die. So remember your vows. Don't die. Stay behind to help the others.
Yeah, that's
Anyone
interesting.
else?
And then in King Lear, of course, you get kind of the opposite thing. Lear dies, and then after him follows Kent. My master calls me, I cannot say no.
So, anyone else have something?
Good stuff. Good stuff. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how, in Buddhism, we're cautioned against conceptual thinking and language as being kind of a hindrance to engaging with reality in its truest form. But I think that literature is particularly interesting because people that write really fantastic literature are good at using language in kind of an abstruse way through metaphors and similes to talk about things without directly talking about them, and to make you perceive associations between things that you would have not perceived before.
Yeah, it's an infuriating relation. I struggle with it all the time. Literary study is an investment in language and words and their significance and their interrelation. This vast network of signification that they construct, and then Zen is just right. Forget that. Yeah. What are Hamlet's last words? The rest is silence.
Yes.
Cheap and easy way out.
Hardly. Look what you had to do to get there.
Yeah.
Maybe call you out. Anybody else have something?
Yeah.
Brennan.
So I'd like to talk a little bit more about Hamlet. I in line with what you were saying about the about direct experience. Even when people are saying your father, as an apparition, has appeared in his full battle armor, and he's just like, "Did you see his face?" You know, he does not believe that for a second. But what he does believe, he's concrete in thinking that he cannot have it his way, so he'd rather die.
Mm.
I think that's that says something. I'm not sure what it says, but I think it says something.
There's a wonderful moment early on when Hamlet is courting Ophelia. And he sends her various love tokens, which she then dutifully delivers to her father, Polonius, who then carries them back to Hamlet's uncle and mother. There's evidence that he's suffering from love, melancholy, and madness, humoral psychology again. But in these trinkets, there is a little love poem that Hamlet writes for Ophelia, and it goes, "Doubt that the stars are fire, doubt that the sun doth move, doubt truth to be a liar, but do not doubt I love." You know, it's on one level, it's the standard kind of fair of Moon, June, soon love songs. When I'm thinking of Led Zeppelin right now. So tumble to the sea, there will still be you and me, that kind of thing. But it's a series of doubts you can entertain before you entertain any doubt in my fidelity. And what is the second of those doubts? Doubt that the sun doth move. This coming about 50 years after Copernicus's treatise on the revolution of the spheres. And so it becomes, this wonderful little paradigmatic moment in Hamlet of the doubt that pervades the play, and that is arguably a consequence of cultural development, scientific developments that have happened almost within Shakespeare's own lifetime.
Anybody else have one? I have one if nobody else has something. It was interesting to me that you chose the Macbeth soliloquy, because I had actually quoted that in a text. Right? And I profiled it as the most negative, pessimistic possible viewpoint on the meaning of our life and everything.
Just warms the cockles of my heart. Being a pessimist by nature myself.
Then I would challenge I would push back on your assertion that samsara is parallel to that. I think in early Hinayana Buddhism it probably is, but in Mahayana it becomes Hinayana or samsara becomes nirvana. Is the only place we have to transform samsara into nirvana. And I quoted Dogen's you're the firewood and ash thing. He said firewood becomes ash and does not become firewood again after it is ash. But do not think that the ash is future and the firewood past. And he goes on to say, just as firewood does not return to firewood, you do not return to life after death. He goes on to say that life is an expression complete this moment, death is an expression complete this moment, and so on. So he uses this metaphor of firewood has past, present, and future in it, in this time when it is firewood. When it is ash, it has past, present, and future in it when it is ash. And he's not exactly denying, but he's saying the linear connection that we see, cause and effect, is less important than the fact that in the present moment. So he's trying to use this as a simile or metaphor for showing life is like that, or birth. He uses birth, not like birth is an expression complete this moment. Death is an expression complete this moment. They're like winter and spring. You do not call winter the beginning of spring or summer the end of spring. So it goes to the seasonal reference for that. So I put that against that to say, it's not exactly that Buddhism is agnostic about this or Zen. It's more, Buddhism is painted with the same brush of being pessimistic because of its focus on suffering, but it's not pessimistic. It's not really optimistic either. It's realistic. It's in the middle.
There is one of my favorite Zen stories.
So the question I had is, do you see samsara absolutely that way, and do you see the Elizabethan or the Shakespearean viewpoint of life as being ultimately nihilistic, pessimistic?
Yeah, well, I think, the Christian consensus wants to propel us out of this process into another static, separate dimension.
Heaven.
Yeah, and Buddhism doesn't do that. It reminds me of, you probably know the story, I don't remember where it comes from. It's one of my favorite Zen stories about a samurai who comes to see a Zen master and says, I have traveled far here to speak to me, master of heaven and hell. Please tell me, what are they? And the Zen master says, oh, you're a piece of shit. Why would I talk to you at all? And the samurai grabs his sword in anger and begins to unsheath it. And the master says, this is hell. And samurai resheathes it and bows and says, this is heaven. So
It seems to me that a lot of the tragic characters have that moment too. And the first thing I think of is when Macbeth says, I dare do all to become a man, he who does more is none. I mean, that's almost like this. I'm right here, man.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. So it seems that they have that a lot of those characters have that moment. Before the crack. Before
certainly,
they
yeah.
fall apart.
When Hamlet says, I'm ready, and that's all that counts.
Yeah.
I'm going in. I'm likely not to live. I know that. I'm prepared. Maybe see that as a moment of.
It kind of like with Lear at the very end. Everybody else is dead, but he has this moment of clarity. It seems to me. Maybe I read it.
Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life and thou no breath at all?
That's it.
We had a similar conversation around the apology of Socrates, was it?
Yeah, I think Tom
knows he's
led
going
us through that.
Be poisoned.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I mean, if you're looking for parallel formulations in Renaissance literature for some of these concepts, another great place to go is Paradise Lost.
Was Shakespeare familiar with Dante?
Shakespeare familiar with Dante? Good question. I don't know of any specific references. Romeo and Juliet actually is mentioned in Dante, but Shakespeare would not have gotten the story from Dante. So I couldn't tell you offhand of any specific references.
So one more time, does anybody have anything further? Anybody? And would you like to make some closing remarks for us, Bruce?
Thank you for allowing me to come here and talk to you. It's been great. I've enjoyed the sit. I've enjoyed getting to know you people. And thanks so much for the questions.
We hope you can come again.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Are you living in California?
No, we live in Tallahassee.
Okay.
I just drove up from Tallahassee. I'm flying out tomorrow to see my sister in Seattle.
We come pretty regularly though to town.
So maybe another time if you come to Atlanta, you can sleep over here. We have some bedrooms. We have a bed and breakfast. And we'd like you to come again and maybe do the Thursday talk show.
That'd be great.
Yeah. And Linda, Bruce's wife's also a really highly regarded visual artist that shows in Atlanta. You show about once a year, it seems.
Yeah, in places some more respectable than others, but yeah, I end up showing up.
We'll go to less respectful. We go to places with good art.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thanks so much.
Thank you
Thank you so very much. Yes.
We usually start and end with Dharma opening verse, Dharma closing verse, but our guest speakers are an exception to that. No, this was the Dharma, however, I think.
Yes. Yes.
It wasn't drama, it was Dharma.
Yeah, that's right.